Thank you, Michael. I wanted to add an anecdote to this discussion. You probably recall that one of the earliest frames that Fillmore used to illustrate the frame idea in linguistics was the commercial transaction frame. And that had to have been, some 37 years ago by now, or so, approximately 35 to 40 years ago by now. And from my perspective, what's particularly interesting about that is the fact that when he first introduced the commercial transaction frame to illustrate the frame idea in linguistics, we all thought about it and talked about it as a single frame. Fast forward all these years, and we have FrameNet, and commercial transaction is now covered in a family of frames in the FrameNet database. So what that tells us is that progress happens. We have a new or better or more sophisticated or more subtle understanding of what's going on with these frames and how best to characterize them in a way that's going to be maximally useful for people, for other researchers who are using the database. Now, it's certainly the case that sometimes FrameNet simply overlooked some criterion for determining frame membership. So we go back and revise, right? But the important message to take from this anecdote is that, like all research, the development of a frame semantics lexical resource is a work in progress. And you have one understanding at one particular point in time, and later on, you may have another understanding. And you go back and revise. That's legitimate. So when those of you who are working on FrameNet Brazil have questions for Thiago, I'm not sure. It could be this, or it could be that, right? He's telling the truth. He's not trying to make your life difficult. What he's really trying to do is have you think about it, have you go home and look at the data, consider the various criteria that will help you create a solid argument for one way or another way. And that's part and parcel of the work that you're doing. Thiago didn't ask me to say that. It's true. It's true. I should add to that anecdote a slightly more personal anecdote. As it happens, I was the first person to write a dissertation in frame semantics and the lexicon. As I was doing that work, I didn't know that I was the first person to write a dissertation in this theoretical framework. And I remember that in my regular meeting with Chuck to talk about my progress and talk about data that I might have found difficult or figure out the best way to frame an argument, I remember that I would often go to his office with a question. And he sat there and said, yeah, I was waiting for an answer. I didn't get an answer. fast forward many years, I'm working on FrameNet, and in our staff meetings, we often talk about things that I struggled with when I was writing my dissertation, which for me is very gratifying, right? It's very gratifying to know that the issues I grappled with back then are the issues we grapple with, and it's okay. Okay, with that, let's move on to what I call the synthesis. And I will begin with an overview of what we find in the FrameNet database. We have lexical units. We define them. We sometimes have a semantic type on a lexical unit. We have a valence description for a lexical unit, and we have annotated example sentences for that lexical unit. We have frames. We have frame definitions, which by definition requires frame elements that we define. Frame elements may also have semantic type information recorded with them, but they don't need to have that. And we have frame-to-frame relations. So the checks on the far right side indicate that these are things we've already discussed. And to provide a focused overview, I'm going to provide a brief review of what each one of those things is, during which time, if anybody would like a clarification or has a question to ask about that, I invite you to do so. A lexical unit is a pairing of a lemma and a frame. Importantly, in FrameNet's lexicographic annotation, a lexical unit is the unit of analysis. Of course, in FrameNet's full text annotation, a lexical unit is also the unit of analysis. The difference between lexicographic annotation and full text annotation is that in lexicographic annotation, we annotate exactly one lexical unit for a sentence. We annotate with respect to that single lexical unit. In full text annotation, we do that many times over for all of the frame-evoking elements in a sentence. A lexical unit definition appears in the Lexical Entry Report. Either it comes from the Collins Oxford Dictionary, or a FrameNet lexicographer writes a very simple, short, straightforward definition. Because, of course, from the perspective of FrameNet, the definition, if you will, derives from the annotations, the annotated sentences that exemplify that lexical unit, the valence description that comes out from the annotation of many sentences that have been annotated for that lexical unit. So having a long prose definition for a lexical unit it misses the point, right? And a valence description of a lexical unit summarizes the combinatorial possibilities of frame elements occurring with that lexical unit. If I remember correctly, someone asked early last week, or somebody said early last week, I don't think I understand what a valence description is. I don't remember who that was. Yeah, is it clear now? Yeah, great. Great, thank you. Annotated sentences provide examples of instances of the occurrences of a lexical unit in actual usage of the language that illustrate the mapping between the semantic role and the syntactic form of the constituents in the sentence. FrameNet is really all about the mapping of semantic role and syntactic form. It embodies meaning and form. Later next week, you'll see that that concept figures significantly in construction grammar as well. That shouldn't be a surprise. So FrameNet moving from developing a lexical resource to developing a constructicon is the natural progression. Remember that Fillmore was developing both theories in tandem at the same time. Frame semantics, construction grammar. Frames characterize a situation, event, relation, or entity in terms of the participants and props, each of which is a frame element. Frames, of course, are the theoretical heart of frame semantics and FrameNet. Frames are the theoretical construct on which all of FrameNet analyses rest. I'm going to repeat that because it's crucial for understanding what FrameNet is all about. Do you have a question?
It's a question as well as an observation. We were discussing here minutes ago about if we have different frames or not.
For a particular
For
lemma.
a particular lemma, yeah.
Yeah.
And you've asked me, all right, but what are the arguments that will help us to prove that the frame
It goes one way or the other. It's a separate frame or it belongs in the same frame.
And I found that when we say these are different frames, I'm implying that there are different frame elements, right?
Correct.
So having different frame elements is not really an argument for having different frames. It's
No, no, I understand what you're saying. I think what you're saying is really it seems circular, but having different frame elements is what we mean when we say having different frame elements is having a different valence description. Now, within a single frame, you could have more than one valence description. After all, there are many event frames where you would find the causative-agentive alternation. So in that sense of a particular lemma, you can either get the causative version or you can get the agentive version. But the key issue is that it's systematic, that alternation is systematic for many, I won't say all, but many, if not all, of the lemmas in that frame, and that the other lemmas in the frame follow these patterns, right? So it's not just having different frame elements, right? And another important factor to consider, or at least to remember, is that, excuse me, is that we define frame elements frame specifically. So agent in the cause fragmentation frame certainly has, on the face of it, the same name as agent in cause start frame. But the frame element label, agent, is actually just a shorthand for agent cause fragmentation. The frame element name agent is actually shorthand for agent cause start. So on the face of it, it appears as though they're the same frame element, but in fact they're different, right? Yeah, Michael.
So the fact that these things are interdefining, we consider to be a feature and not a bug. I think that's the short way to say it.
Yeah.
So for example, start, just to choose a slightly different example, start has to be defined in terms of finish, and finish has to be defined in terms of start. You know, I mean, many things in life are actually interdefining. So the frame defines the frame elements, and the frame elements define the frame. The question is, inductively, as you go through and you try to look at examples, do a cluster of properties co-occur? Is there a gestalt there? Something that leads you to believe you have a single category. And that's what all of this is innate of. So, you know, we have many different criteria, many different arguments, but it's all about figuring out, do we have the same category or not?
I'd like just to add an extra information on top of that. Monica, we only analyze in FrameNet from corpus. So defining frame elements or frames themselves involve reading lots of sentences, you know. So when you deal with data, it's kind of hard to be circular, you know, because you're not just making up examples, crafting your own sentences and saying, oh, I want this to be this frame element because the sentence I invented fits it. Okay, because if you start with a good idea of that frame, you can end with a very good but different idea of that same frame because you looked at sentences and they just don't fit your initial idea. Okay?
Right, that's a good point. And indeed, in the early days of FrameNet, many of our discussions and debates at a staff meeting were about whether a particular usage was in frame for the frame under consideration or not. And at a certain point, someone, usually Chuck, would say, look in the corpus. Okay, we could talk about it all we want, but let's see what the data say. And that reminds me about a question that someone asked, I think yesterday, about the difference between bottom up and top down. And they didn't quite understand the difference because they also heard me say they serve the same purpose, right? Well, they do serve the same purpose. You begin with a theoretical framework and an overarching view of how you're going to approach the data. Then that's top down. And then you look at the data, and the data may actually tell you that you have to revise your theory, right? In contrast to other paradigms in linguistics, we don't look for data that fits our theory. We let the data tell us what do we need to do to refine our theory so that it captures what the data say. Okay, let's go on with our synthesis. So a frame definition describes how frame elements relate to each other and characterize the situation that the frame describes. This speaks to Monica's comment, which was essentially about, wait a minute, this is kind of circular. But okay, yeah, it is. In addition, a frame definition also provides often fabricated canonical examples. The point of including a canonical example in the frame definition of a frame is to provide the user with a simple, straightforward, unencumbered, not syntactically complex sentence that illustrates in a very clear way the kind of situation this frame characterizes. As such, we have no difficulty in making up an example for that purpose.
Because the corpus does not really comply with the ideas of simplicity.
Right, because as we know, language doesn't comply with the needs of simplicity. Right? So we rely on the corpus for the data that's going to tell us how does this lexical unit actually work in this language, as well as to tell us what we might need to change in our theory. At the same time, expedience requires that we fabricate, we make up an example to illustrate a single point. A frame definition also includes a prose description of how to differentiate among frames that sometimes are easily confused. We do that, FrameNet does that, when that's necessary. Not every frame is likely to be confused with one or more other frames that have similar kinds of LUs or characterize a similar kind of situation. Next. A frame element identifies the semantic role that instantiates a participant, prop, or other concept in the situation that the frame describes. Frame elements are named mnemonically. The idea is that the frame element name will give both the lexicographer as well as the user of FrameNet data, a hint about what that frame element captures. Which role, which participant, which prop in the frame. I would be silly if I wanted to name what we call instrument result. What would be the point, right? Using instrument as the frame element name for constituents that identify instruments to accomplish something helps me remember that that's what that is. A frame element definition also includes a canonical and often fabricated examples. Confession. FrameNet does not always include canonical examples with frame element definitions, and we know they should be there. Note also that the information provided in FrameNet for frame element parallels the information provided in FrameNet for frames, right? We characterize semantic roles, we include a canonical example, we identify, right, both in frames and in frame elements. In general, frame-to-frame relations in the FrameNet database indicate the semantic relationships between frames that also facilitate inferencing, except for reframing mappings and see also, both of which look exactly like other frame-to-frame relations. They actually do something different from what the other frame-to-frame relations in the database do. These are the relations, so-called frame-to-frame relations, that we're going to be looking at today.
And the other ones we'll talk about tomorrow, so don't worry.
Right. So, what's in the FrameNet database, and what have we already talked about? Lexical unit, definition of the lexical unit, the Valence description for a lexical unit, and annotated sentences that illustrate how that lexical unit is actually used in the language. For frames, we have a frame definition, we have frame elements, and we have frame-to-frame relations. The three items on this list that we haven't talked about are semantic type, which Michael will get to at the end of the week, and frame-to-frame relations. These special frame-to-frame relations we're going to talk about today. And tomorrow's lecture, in the early part of the session, will be about all the other frame-to-frame relations. So, the frame-to-frame relations that we're going to look at after the break are see also, which provides a cross-reference to other easy-to-confuse frames. Reframing mapping facilitates the reassignment of annotation in one frame to another frame. Any questions? Is everybody clear on what each of the constructs that FrameNet includes covers? Okay, we're going to have a break.